When we think about the first meetings between Europeans and American Indians, the story often gets boiled down to something really simple, like conquest or peace. But the real story, it was so much more complicated. It was this huge, centuries-long geopolitical chess match. And today, we're going to dig into the different strategies, the high-stakes plays, and the legacies of this incredibly complex encounter.
Okay, so right off the bat, you have to understand this one core thing. This quote nails it. This idea, this fundamental power imbalance, was at the heart of pretty much every single interaction. It was a mindset that shaped everything, from how they traded goods to who had the right to claim land. So this power imbalance was kind of like an invisible hand, pushing and pulling the future of the entire continent. It forced American Indian groups to figure out how to survive in this new and, let's be honest, often hostile world. But if we only see this as a story of victims, we're missing half the picture, and frankly, the most surprising half. And this is where the story gets really fascinating. American Indian nations weren't just sitting back and letting things happen to them. No way. They were active players on the world stage. They were savvy, and they strategically played the rivalries between European powers against each other in a serious game of survival. And just look at how sophisticated their strategies were. They'd make an alliance with one European group to fight another one, or even to gain an edge against a rival native group. They learned to navigate totally new economies. And sometimes the smartest move was just to pack up and move to preserve their way of life. This was way more layered than a simple us versus them story. So, with these native nations playing such a clever game, how did the different European powers handle it? Well, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Not at all. In fact, as we're about to see, each of the big European empires came in with a completely different playbook. All right, so this table breaks it all down beautifully. You've got the Spanish, who were all about subjugation and converting people to Christianity. They used missions and the absolutely brutal encomienda system, which was basically a grant of native labor. Then you've got the French and the Dutch. They saw native people mostly as business partners, key allies in the super lucrative fur trade. And finally, the British. They wanted one thing more than anything else: land, permanent settlements. And that one goal, that hunger for land, set them on a direct collision course with the people who were already living there. So let's zoom in on that British model, because their constant need for more and more land just created this incredibly explosive situation. This wasn't about trade partners or converting souls. It was about getting people out of the way. And the perfect, tragic example of this is a conflict known as Metacom's War. For a little while, things were okay. There was a fragile peace, some cultural exchange. But this timeline shows you just how fast that fell apart. As the British population exploded through the mid-1600s, so did their appetite for land. What started as shaky coexistence turned into constant encroachment on native lands, pushing the whole region right to the breaking point. So you have to ask, what was the final straw? Well, for Metacom, the leader of the Wampanoag, he saw with crystal clarity what was happening. He knew the British expansion wasn't just about taking a field here or a forest there. It was an existential threat. It was going to completely erase his people's way of life. So, with that conviction, Metacom did something incredible. He built a powerful alliance of different tribes and launched these devastating attacks against the colonists. But, and this is key, the British formed their own critical alliance with the powerful Mohawk nation. A Mohawk ambush was the turning point. It led to Metacom's death, and with him gone, the unified resistance just crumbled. It ended up reinforcing the British strategy of simply pushing tribes off their land. Okay, now let's shift gears and head to the southwest for a totally different story of resistance, this time against the Spanish. See, here, the goal wasn't to push people out. It was to control them. And that approach sparked one of the most successful indigenous rebellions in the history of North America. The Spanish playbook was built on force. They used some truly brutal tactics to try and convert the Pueblo people to Christianity and to trap them in this rigid caste system where they were just a source of labor. The goal was to absorb and control, not displace. But in 1680, after decades of this oppression, the Pueblo people united and they revolted. And in one of the most stunning turnarounds in colonial history, they won. For 12 years, they drove the Spanish completely out of their territory. They reclaimed their freedom. 12 years. I mean, that was an absolutely unprecedented victory. But the story doesn't quite end there. The Spanish did eventually come back. They returned with military force and they reconquered their capital in Santa Fe. And on the surface, you might look at that and think, Well, the revolt failed in the end.
And this is what makes their story so incredible. Even though the Spanish came back, the revolt had fundamentally changed the game. The Spanish realized they couldn't just force their will on the Pueblo people anymore. They were forced to make compromises, to tolerate Pueblo cultural and religious practices in a way that would have been completely unthinkable before the revolt. So when you put these two stories, Metacom's War and the Pueblo Revolt, side by side, you really see how indigenous agency, even when you're up against these massive, powerful forces, had a real and lasting impact on how history played out.
And here you see the two legacies laid out plain and simple. In New England, crushing Metacom's War just emboldened the British. It confirmed their strategy of displacement. But in the Southwest, the Pueblo's successful long-term resistance forced the Spanish to bend, to compromise. It created a future with a level of cultural accommodation that was just impossible to imagine in the British colonies. And that really leaves us with a powerful question to think about, doesn't it? Even with these huge power imbalances, what does the Pueblo Revolt really show us about the legacy of resistance? It suggests that even when a final, clean military victory isn't on the table, the very act of fighting back can reshape the future, setting new rules and creating patterns that echo for centuries.